I loved in the introduction how you talked about the Umbrian gardener,
Yeah.
Mr. Cardoni, as a way of talking about getting into gardening.
Mhm.
Um, could you talk about how you and Guy started, Guy being your husband, who you have, I love that the dedication, you have grown with Guy,
Yes,
the
in
two of
many
you.
ways.
But
Uh,
how
yeah.
you and Guy started, because it's sort of, you look at your backyard and it's daunting you. How do you get started? And how did you and
Well,
Guy do it?
we started small, and I think that's one of the big mistakes that would-be gardeners make, is that they have an ambitious plan and they're not really thinking it through. So we started very small. When Guy was in medical school, we lived in an apartment, and in the back there was just this tiny little piece of land, and he would put little things in there like basil, a few tomato plants, a zucchini plant. And that's how we started, from that little apartment backyard garden. And then over time, you know how it is, it just got bigger and bigger and bigger, because once you see achievement with something, then you say, oh, I'm going to go the next step. And so now, fast forward to today, this garden is 30 by 60 and feeds not only us, but a lot of our neighbors, for whom we give a lot of this stuff away. So I think I'd like to say, and I have said this in the book, that Italians in general have this in their DNA to grow vegetables, because where did we get this interest from? We got it from our parents who had gardens, our grandparents. My grandmother, who lived with us, the Neapolitan grandmother, had a very small piece of land behind the house where she grew peppers up a trellis, and she had green beans, and she made maximum use of the small amount of land that she had. So it's part of us, it's part of our DNA. And we, as children, watched this and also absorbed this subconsciously. It's not that we were saying to ourselves when we were teenagers, oh, I want a garden just like Nona has. No, we were thinking, what, are they crazy? Yeah, but at some point in your life, you come back full circle to things. And that was one of the things that we came back to.
Makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
When you traveling in Italy, you see this definitely.
You see this everywhere, and this is why when we were searching for places to film with the film crew that year in Umbria, as we were driving around, I'm very conscious of what's around me, and I see this little guy in a little French beret hat. He's all dressed up in his tweed jacket, and he's out there with a hole in the garden. So I said, we have to stop. We've got to stop. This is perfect. It's a home garden. Let's see what's there. So we just barged in, and I started talking to him, and he was very, very proud of everything. And he started telling me how his whole family is involved in this process. His wife, his sister-in-law, his brother-in-law, they all live together. And once they knew we were there, they all came out. They started taking up watering cans and, rakes and things, and they started working the garden and telling us about what they had there. Now, and the other thing that was very reassuring is that Pietro said to me, we have a plot of land here because we live in Umbria. We live in a place where there's land, but most Italians live in very crowded places. And that got me thinking about, well, how can they take advantage of fresh vegetables if they're not going to a market? And I say in my book, look up. If you're in a city, look up. And what you'll see are balconies where there are potted plants, things like olive trees,
Right.
for instance, basil plants, tomato plants, even rooftop gardens.
Figs.
Yes, figs. And you know what? Today, I noticed that a lot of places in the cities have these rooftop gardens. It's a big thing today. So you don't need to think, oh, I can't do it. You can do it, because you can be very creative in so many ways. You could become a member of a community garden, which
Right.
got very popular, especially during the pandemic, if you recall. Community gardens. You can take part in your farmer's market. You can go to the grocery store when vegetables are in season and cook with them according to the recipes in the cookbook. What I'm trying to convey to people is that Italians cook in season, and they cook with fresh ingredients, and they keep the treatment simple.
It's true, so true. I grew up only eating strawberries in June, and
Right.
raspberries were around for 2 weeks, and
Yes.
that
Yes.
was that.
Right. That's
Corn
right.
was just at the end of the summer, and
Yeah. And you went on to the next thing. Now, recently, I was in Umbria. I just took a group to Umbria, and there was a woman in the group, and she was ordering off the menu, and she wanted, this is now October that I was there, she said she would like to have melon and prosciutto. And the waitress is waving her finger like this, and she said, "No, non è la stagione per il melone." So the Italians are very aware of what's in season. They're not going to touch things that aren't in season. So what she was telling her is, "Madam, you can have the prosciutto, but melon is out because this isn't the season for melon."
so you uh, you have some great advice in the book. And when you started all those years ago, did you have any disasters?
Oh,
Would people
sure.
feel comfortable? And what are some of the most important lessons you've learned, and what would be useful
Yeah.
for people starting out in terms of
Well,
gardening tips?
some of the advice I would give for anybody starting out is to think small. Think small. And when you think small, think about the zone, the gardening zone that you live in. Because if you pick the wrong vegetables, you're not going to have too much success with them. I'll give you a perfect example. Oh, and the other thing is, get a soil test. If you're thinking about planting a garden someplace, the first thing you want to do is get a soil test, which you can send away to like an extension service, or I think, in town here, the university has a program like that. Several universities
Every state has an
has a
extension
program.
service.
So you get a soil test, so you'll know, is this a good place to plant the garden? So you want to think small. You want to make sure you're in the right zone for the types of vegetables you want to grow. Get a soil sample, and where is the location of the garden? Because you need at least 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight for your plants to flourish. The other thing is, don't get too ambitious. Pick American winners. Like, for instance, why do they give children a radish seed to grow in a little grow pot? Because they know that radishes are pretty reliable. They're going to come up no matter what. So you want to start with some plants that are simple, like radishes, lettuces, spinach, and then you can get into the more complicated things as you get more confidence. For instance, one year, and I talk about this in the book, I said to my husband Gaetano, because the book is based on, of course, on 30 years of gardening for the Ciao Italia series, in which we have 2 episodes based on the garden in each series. So that's a lot of vegetables over a 30-year span. But I usually give him his marching orders in January and tell him, this is what I'm going to focus on when I'm doing the show. So I need these vegetables from you. And so I asked him to grow me some globe artichokes. That's a tall order in New Hampshire, because first of all, you have to call up Mother Nature, and you have to say, now look, I need about 50 days where the temperatures are pretty constant, around 55, 60 degrees. Well, you know how that works. It's New England. But by and large, he grew these beautiful globe artichokes, of which there's a gorgeous picture in the front of the book. And I was like, this is better than a diamond. Oh my God, we got 12 artichokes. And the reason I wanted them is because it's a vegetable that a lot of people shy away from. They look at it, it looks imposing, it looks threatening. What the heck do you do with it? But
Or how do you eat it?
And how do you eat it? So once you make them comfortable with the knowledge of, hey, let me show you what to do with an artichoke, then, it's not so daunting. So I wanted to grow them because I love the Roman way of doing artichokes. There's several ways to do them. One way, of course, is to stuff them and steam them, and you can stuff them with farro, any kind of a grain. You can stuff them with meat. You can stuff them with breadcrumb seasoned herb mixture. And that was one that my mother would always use. But when I'm in Rome, I head right for the Jewish quarter. And
Right.
this restaurant called Il Piperno, because Il Piperno prepares artichokes the old Roman Jewish way, which is to take the entire artichoke and submerge it into boiling oil. And now this creates a flower because artichoke is a member of the thistle family. You let an artichoke go to seed, you're going to get this nice, beautiful purple thistle. So it fans out those leaves. They're crispy like potato chips. And the Romans just give it a drizzle of extra virgin olive oil. I'm sure you've had this, Sarah, when you've been traveling in Italy. That is just, it's a mystical experience. But they're so
And there's
easy.
that street full of restaurants.
Oh, yes. And when
that
you go
have
to the
them.
markets, you're going to see mountains of these artichokes coming from Puglia, from Sicily. They're mainly coming from the southern regions of Italy. So once you gain confidence about gardening, then you can branch out and try some of these more, I don't want to say exotic, but more, a little bit more challenging vegetables.
And they are beautiful too.
Oh, yeah.
So beautiful.
Yeah.
So now there are so many reasons to compost too, to improve the soil, but also reduction of waste in your kitchen, which is we're all learning so much more about.
Yeah. Yes.
How would you suggest beginning?
Well, here's what we did. We've done a variety of things. We've bought composters, like the barrel ones where you have a handle and you turn all this material over. That worked for about a month, and I said, nope, no good. So then we got some chicken wire, and we built a square enclosure with the chicken wire. And we started collecting our vegetable. You can't use meat scraps or fish bones or anything like that. You need vegetable matter, nut seeds, coffee grinds, tea bags, banana skins, that kind of vegetable material, fruits, nuts, that kind of thing. And you build layers. You start with an area where you have an enclosure, like we did with the chicken wire. And then you start with some brown or white paper. Like grocery store bags, you can use those. You wet those down. You add dirt. You add your vegetable leftover seedlings and things. You keep making layers like this, and you wet this, and then you let it sit for a while, and then eventually you need to turn this over several times and continue on. I went from 3 bags of waste that I would put at the curb to 1 bag.
Bravo.
And I have to say, I keep a compost pail in my garage. And when I'm cooking, I must walk 10,000 miles just to go to the compost. Eggshells up in the compost, tea bags up in the compost, onion skins up in the everything is in the compost. And then when the pail is full, I take it up to the enclosure, put it in, add more brown paper, white paper, soil, wet it down, keep it moist, turn it over. And eventually this is all going to break down into some very, very fine grained compost material. And then we take that and we sprinkle it over the garden. Then we work it into the soil before we put the plants in. I think everyone can compost. Even if you don't have a garden, think about, giving your composted material to a friend who does have a garden. They'll appreciate it.
And I know that the city of Boston has started composting, doing pickup of compost.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
I have seen them in Exeter too. It may be that we need to pay for it, but
yeah,
it certainly is possible.
But it has cut down on the amount of garbage that we put out at the curb. It's amazing.
And you're getting your 8,000 steps in every day.
And that's it.
So you have some great tips in the book about tools, necessary tools. What should no gardener be without?
No gardener should be without a scuffle hole. That is probably the most reliable, important, easy to use tool in the garden. And the other thing is a Cape Cod weeder. Those two, scuffle hole and a Cape Cod weeder.
I think you need to do some describing here.
Okay, so a scuffle hole is a long handled instrument that has a round kind of tooth-bearing
Hmm.
steel attachment, like a comb at the end of it. And you move this back and forth very easily over the soil, which kind of scratches the soil so the soil gets aerated, and it removes weeds. So you're not down on all fours, trying to pull these things up, because sometimes these weeds can be pretty deep. So that's an important tool, because you want it to go between the rows when you're planting. This is a tool that will easily go between the rows. Then the Cape Cod weeder is like a right angled tool that has a very sharp tip. And this is for getting weeds close to the base of the plant. Because if you try to use the scuffle hole there, you could tear the plants, the leaves. So you need those two tools. They're the most important things.
And where do you get these tools? Do you need to order them from a catalog, or are they at your
Yeah,
hardware store?
you can get them online like Gardener's Supply, or you can go to your local hardware store. I just bought a new scuffle hole online from a Canadian company called Hoss in Canada. I got this as a Christmas present for my husband, so that's what he's getting, he's getting a new a scuffle hole. So yeah, online garden centers, they'll have them.
So related, I know that you tell Guy in January what
Yeah.
he needs to grow, but do you pour over seed catalogs and
Yes, of
you
course.
spend, so this is a downtime of the year for a gardener. You're
No,
planning.
no, January is when you got to be up and ready, pay attention, because as I tell you in the book, the first thing we do is get out a yellow legal pad. I see another tip about what not to do is to just go out there and just put things in nilly-willy. You need to have a plan. It's got to make sense. The garden has to look right. So many gardens I've been in are jumbled, this and that. The weeds are everywhere. The vines are growing across each other. Oh, it's a mess. So on paper, you lay it out. And we try to lay it out to scale. So if you have been gardening, you realize that you cannot put plants in the same spot you put them in the year before, because those plants may have left some sort of bacteria in the soil. So for instance, tomatoes, if you planted your tomatoes on the left side of the garden last year, this year you're going to plant them on the right side of the garden. So you rotate these crops so that, you eliminate disease from infiltrating into these early seedlings. So on paper, we get this all planned out. We know what we're going to plant. We know how many of these plants we're going to plant. We know how far they're going to be spaced apart. So that determines how many seedlings we're going to grow under grow lights, because we're not going to grow 70 tomato plants, although we did last year, and not have 70 holes to put them in. So you need to space them out. You need to know what these plants require. And part of this book, and I don't want anyone to think that you have to have a PhD in husbandry to understand this book. I made this very simple. I divided this book into the spring garden and the summer garden. So you had an idea of what kind of plants you can plant in the spring. For instance, lettuce. Why? Because lettuce likes cool weather. Don't try planting lettuce in August. It's going to be a disaster. Lettuce does not like hot weather. So these just tips like this that you need to know. Spinach, another cool weather crop. Broccoli rape, radishes. Those kinds of things can take the coolness of the soil. Whereas in the summer, you want to plant peppers, eggplants, zucchini, tomatoes, those things that require heat. So we put this all on paper. We know what we're going to plant and where it's going to go. And then the next thing is, of course, we pour through these seed catalogs. Now, a lot of these seeds we buy in Italy when we're there. We buy packaged seeds in the different markets. But for this book, I also got some wonderful help from Johnny Seeds in Maine, because, they're a little colder than we are, but their seeds are adaptable for New England. And I tell you this in the book. I said, look, anyone can use this book no matter where they live, if it's Georgia, Florida, New Hampshire. But here's the thing to realize. I have to plant my lettuce when all danger of frost is past. But the people in Georgia or Florida, they can plant lettuce 6 weeks ahead of us because they're warmer, right? So you take this into consideration. So you know what zone you're in, so you know what plants are going to do best in the zone that you live in. Once we
That
have,
was one of your first pieces of advice.
yeah. So once you have everything on paper, you know which seeds you're going to use, then the fun begins, because you want to start, or we like to start a lot of our plants from seeds. Some plants we start with seedlings, but for most things like lettuce, cool weather crops, we're doing that from seed. And so we're down in the basement. We have our medium. We have our little grow pots, which I talked to you about in the book. We put the seeds in, they're under grow lights, and now you wait. And you wait until you see the miracle of life
Yeah.
forward in a little seed pot. So now you're watching these and you're watering them, okay, and you're making sure they're not getting too leggy. And when they are, about 6 inches, then what you have to do is do something called hardening off, which means that you just don't take them from their comfy little bed where they've been under grow lights and plop them in the ground, because that's a shock to these plants. What you need to do is get them adapted to the outside. So you do something called hardening off, which means you bring the little seedlings outside during the day, you'll put them in the sun, try to keep out of the wind, leave them there, bring them in at night when it's good. And you do this, for about a week, 2 weeks. So they're adjusted now. Then you're watching the weather, and when all frost is no longer in place, you can commit these little seedlings to the ground. And that's my job. So Guy digs the holes. I'm on bended fours and putting in these 100 lettuce plants because we love salad. I know this is a little bit much, but Guy can't help himself. So we get these gorgeous bouquets. You've seen some of the pictures in the book.
Yeah.
I mean, they are bouquets. A bride could carry
They-
one of these lettuce heads down the aisle. They're gorgeous. And we start eating our own tender lettuce, and we give heads away to our neighbors. Everybody's happy. And then come June, the lettuce now starting to look still good, but July is going to kill it. August going to kill it. And we know that. So by the time July comes, we're thinking about the fall planting of lettuce, because we can get 2 crops because of where we live. So in early September, we go through that whole drill again down in the basement. Then when those seedlings are ready, we put them in. And right now, this is November 30th, we are still eating lettuce from the garden.
It's wonderful.
Believe it or not, we're still eating beautiful heads of lettuce from the garden. Come January, it's like we're at a funeral. We no longer have our own lettuce, and now we have to go to the farmer's market or a reliable place, because personally I think grocery store lettuce is pathetic, but we're spoiled. This is the problem, that we're so spoiled. And Guy has a method that I talked to you about in the book about how you make a salad. I mean, we call it the 10-minute toss, but anyway, yeah. So those are some tips.
Those are fabulous tips. That's great. And the recipes in your book, as you've talked about being so important to be seasonal.
Yeah.
Do you have some favorites?
Oh gosh, there's so
I
many.
know it's hard. They're all your
hard.
babies.
They are. They're all, but I'll tell you, peppers, we grow a pepper called corno di toro, which means the horn of the bull, kind of shaped like a banana pepper. These are very thin-walled peppers. They're crunchy. They're stuffable. They're great grilled. I love them. And that is one of my very favorite vegetables in the garden, the corno di toro, elongated peppers. And people don't realize that, peppers start out green, but if you leave them there long enough, they're going to turn red. So and then one of the other ones, of course, is, well, this year, actually, this is 2 years into this particular plant, we grew the Pianolo del Vesuvio cherry tomato, which is bigger than our cherry tomatoes, like a Sun Gold, you know, or a Sweet 100. This cherry tomato is elongated with just a point at the end.
Hmm.
And we got the seeds when we were in Italy. Now, this is a tomato that grows at the base of Mount Vesuvius. So obviously the taste is the taste of that soil, the terroir. And we grew them, and there's a picture of them in the book, a beautiful picture in the front of these tomatoes, which makes fabulous salad tomatoes, or a wonderful tomato sauce, which I call a blistered tomato sauce, which is nothing like what you would get in a grocery store in a jar that has all these foreign ingredients in it. It's so simple. I don't understand why people can't do this. I don't care. You take any cherry tomato, cut it in half lengthwise, put a little extra virgin olive oil in a pan, get a couple cloves of garlic, just kind of smash them around in the oil till it flavors the oil, take that out, put these cut up tomatoes in, cook them around for 3 or 4 minutes just so they collapse, salt, pepper, a little basil.
Heaven.
It's heaven. And it's real. It's none of this processed stuff that people are spending $7 or $8 for a jar of what? You know, yeah. But
I agree.
It's so simple. It's so simple. So they're one of my favorites. I dry those as well. And then for the excess, because we had 70 tomato plants, so you can imagine.
Lucky you.
Yeah. So I made, in the book, there's a wonderful recipe for a tomato marmalade that is great with soft cheeses or even on a bruschetta. But what I loved about doing this recipe was that I was thinking about Christmas, and I thought, well, what can I give my neighbors and friends? So I made jars and jars of this. I put them in little pint jars, glass jars, and then I froze them in the glass jar. And they're perfect. I've been taking them out, you know, and a friend of mine, actually the wife of the president of the university, I had given her a jar. She says, you know, I'm all out of that. Like, you know, where's the next jar? So there are ways to utilize all the produce in the garden without, you know, in novel ways and also in traditional ways. If you want to can, great. I gave up canning years ago because I was so subjected to that as I was a kid. I grew to hate it. There's a story in the book called Seasons in the Cellar that explains why I threw up my hands on canning and went to drying vegetables and freezing them and making pickled vegetables, which is very popular right now. It's good for your gut, fermentation, and these are very easy to do. It's not, you know, it's not like you have to be Einstein to figure this out. So those are some of the things that I do with what's coming out of the garden.
Sounds great. Now, for a novice gardener, what would be the first vegetable and the first herb that if they were just trying one of each, what would you recommend?
First vegetable and a first herb. Well, I would right off the bat say plant zucchini. You cannot kill it. In fact, you may be surprised by what you get, you know. So zucchini, and for an herb, my favorite is flat leaf Italian parsley because I use it for everything. So Italians wouldn't think of cooking without herbs. So the key herbs are flat leaf Italian parsley. Curly parsley is nice, but it doesn't have any flavor. And it's great for decorating a plate. But no, give me the flat leaf. So when I have bushes of flat leaf parsley, what I do with that is I take it, I mince it, I get a lot of it. I mince it by hand, not in a food processor because it's mushy. So I mince it by hand. Then I have pieces of, I use press and seal. Pieces of press and seal. I take increments of like a half a cup, wrap each one up individually, put them in plastic bags, I throw them in the freezer. Then when I need to make soup, stew, whatever, I just drag it out and put it in. It's great. The one herb that is probably the most famous for Italians to use is basil, of course. Now, basil presents a lot of problems. First of all, we grow that under what we call rime or row covers because we don't want holes in the leaves and we don't want some bug to get it. So if you buy this gauze-like material called rime or row cover, what we do is we put these wire hoops, put the plants in the ground. Then we get these wire hoops and we extend them outside the plant. Then we put the row cover over. So we've made a tunnel effect. And the plants get water, they get sunlight, and they don't get bugs. So now we have this huge crop of basil. What are we going to do with it? Well, obviously we're going to make pesto.
Pesto.
That's number one. But you know what? I've come to not like frozen pesto. Something is lost in the freezing process. Basil is a very fickle plant. First of all, it does not like water on its leaves. It does not like cold. How many times have you brought a bunch of basil into the house and put it in a jar of water and sat it on the counter? 2 days later, it's all limp, like, it's starved to death. I have a better method. So what we did was, when we collect the basil, we put it in just a little bit of water, the stems. Guy usually smashes the stem with a hammer. That allows more water to go up the stem. And then we cover the whole thing. Doesn't look pretty, but the whole point is to preserve this. We get a plastic bag, just a dry plastic bag from the grocery store, and we put it over the plant. I'm telling you, 2 weeks, it works like a little greenhouse. So there's something symbiotic going on between the plastic bag and the basil.
And the smashed roots with a little bit of water.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So what I do with the basil is we make a lot of pesto. And in the book, I tell you that if you are in Liguria, which is the capital of basil, right? These people are very serious about how you make pesto. You would never use a food processor. Don't even think about it because it bruises the leaves too much. You got to use a mortar and a pestle. But I tell you, if you absolutely have to use a food processor, here's a trick. Pick the tiniest leaves off of the plant. Now you're going to need a lot more volume-wise, right, than if you had the big jobbies. You pick these tiny leaves and you can put them in the food processor. And why am I telling you this? Because you don't have to pulse it to death. 1, 2, you're done, right? And then you add your extra virgin olive oil.
It's like a mortar and pestle.
Yes. So the classic way to do it is with a mortar and a pestle. So what I do is I make enough jars that I can put in the refrigerator. I cover the pesto with a layer of extra virgin olive oil, sealing it.
So after you've made it with extra
After I've made it, I put it in jars and I leave a little bit of room at the top and I fill that area with extra virgin olive oil. You don't want any air there. Cap it, put it in the refrigerator. So when it comes time to use it, you take it out and you're scooping out some of that pesto. And whatever you've left behind, you have to recover again with olive oil. Otherwise, it's all going to turn brown. It's not very pretty, So
delicious.
I've tried different methods. I've tried putting whole basil leaves between layers of salt. And, that works. It's limpy looking, but it does turn gray. I've tried the freezer thing. That doesn't work for me. I've tried taking the leaves and just putting them in small sandwich bags, layered, flat, get all the air out and everything, throw them in the freezer. That's fine for if you want to use them to put in soup, stews, sauces. But you cannot use them in salad because they're just going to all, turn limp. So my advice is use that basil as frequently as you can fresh. And then if you want to make some pesto and do that olive oil sealing, do that.
So speaking of zucchini, I loved the headline of the chapter on zucchini. Be careful what you ask for.
Yeah.
They can be gigantic.
Right.
And the idea of the grated zucchini soup
Mhm.
for those giant ones is just perfect.
Oh, yeah.
I am a huge zucchini bread fan, but I loved your cakettes.
Yeah, the little cakettes. Yeah, well,
Tell us about those.
well, that's how I use the zucchini that got away from me. And I just use a stand cheese grater and I grate the zucchini until I get to the seedy part. And then, I dump that. So I just take the pulp that's around the seeds, I grate it up. And then, and it's not only just good for the cakettes, but I also put this in meatloaf because it adds such moisture to meatloaf. And it's a great way
meatloaf often needs that.
Yes. And it's a great way for me to fool my son, Chris, who hates zucchini and he loves meatloaf. So when I make it, he's just lapping this stuff up and he has no idea that there's zucchini in there. So then I do it, like you were making a quick bread. So you've got flour, and you can use extra virgin olive oil instead of
Mhm.
butter if you want. The grated zucchini, I add sometimes orange zest, some cinnamon, cloves, sugar, eggs, put it in a loaf pan, or for the cakeettes, I do this in little, you can do it in muffin tins, or I have little cake rings that you could use. And it's just the right size. And you serve
That's
this, yeah,
perfect.
it's perfect. It's perfect. It's moist, delicious.
And the zucchini, the fried zucchini that
Oh,
looks like a grilled
sandwiches.
cheese sandwich.
Yeah.
Ooh,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yes. Yeah. Or you're stuffing zucchini. I mean, there's so many ways to use it. Zucchini soup. I know eventually people get sick of it, but by the end of the summer, I'm wondering what the heck am I going to do next? I've even done zucchini chips on my dehydrator. Yeah.
I have one more question for you. I know we've gone a little over the time, so thank you so much for
Oh
being
my
here.
gosh.
You call arugula the herb of biblical proportion. What
Yeah.
do you mean by that?
Well, arugula is mentioned in the Old Testament in the Book of Kings. And I took my inspiration from using it from that biblical text. So it's one of the few herbs that's ever mentioned in the Old or the New Testament. So to me, it's an herb of biblical proportions. And arugula selvata, with the wild arugula, which is the one that we grow that has the sawtooth edges, almost looks like an oak leaf, is very peppery. And the ancients thought of this herb as a gift from God because it could cure so many ailments. So if you had upset stomach, you ate arugula. The Romans chewed it as if it was like a palate cleanser, cleaning your teeth, just like mint. They used mint for the same purpose. So that's why it's considered an herb of biblical proportions.
Marianne, I could talk to you all afternoon. This is so much fun. I
Oh,
love,
yeah. Well, we're going to meet for
love
lunch,
talking
right?
with you. Say it again.
We're going to meet for lunch, right? We'll talk more about
We're
that.
we're going to meet for lunch.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And then next August, I'm coming for tomatoes and then
Got
zucchini.
it. You got it. Open invitation, please.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
You're just
Sarah.
the best. And this book is a treasure. Don't miss it.